Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1010 for June 25th, 2023. Coming up in a few minutes.
I think it is incredible. I mean, Charlie, you like me, you will have been in and around this industry for longer than you care to remember. But probably, between either of us would have a 40-year horizon to look at this.
This is going to be fun. I put together veteran whiskey writers and consultants Ian Buxton and Charlie Maclean on a Zoom call this week, asked them whether we're in a golden age of Scotch whisky, and sat back to listen. You'll learn a lot from listening to their discussion. I know I did. That's coming up later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Ever wondered where Redbreast got its name? Well, let's go back to 1912 and be glad our bird-watching founder didn't spot the bar-tailed godwit that day. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
How about a really great 12-year-old Scotch whiskey? I have a stellar recommendation coming up for you in just a minute. Spoiler alert, it's Dewar's 12-year-old.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. We don't talk much about the craft malting business, and perhaps we should be paying more attention to it. That's because Skagit Valley Malting in Washington closed its doors and is expected to file for bankruptcy protection. The malt house supplied Westland and more than 270 other small-scale distilleries and breweries. The website Good Beer Hunting reports several other malt houses have closed in the past year, largely because of the lack of economies of scale without massive investments of capital. Updating a story we reported now, and speaking of bankruptcy, the industry-funded corporation set up to manage Scotland's deposit return scheme filed for administration this week. Circularity Scotland's investors decided to not put more money into the operation, to keep it in mothballs until October of 2025, when a UK-wide return scheme is set to go into effect. Meanwhile, Wales is moving ahead with a return scheme of its own, one that will include glass bottles. Industry groups are upset with the plan. Speyside Distillers is in hot water with some cask investors. The owner of the Spey distillery has been accused of misplacing casks bought by investors more than 20 years ago. According to the Mirror, in both cases, Speyside indicated that a lack of records from previous ownership make it impossible to trace the casks. The distillery was sold to its current owners in 2012. We've asked Speyside Distillers Managing Director Patricia Dillon for her side of the story. So far, we've received no response. In other news, the San Francisco World Spirits Competition handed out its trophies recently, and Tomatin's 36-year-old was named Best in Show for Whiskeys. Tomatin's Scott Adamson was just one of many at the distillery, cheering that announcement.
Being able to say that we've made the best whiskey in the world is an incredible thing. And I think particularly when it's a whiskey like the 36-year-old, to have been made all that time ago by a different group of people, to have been held in our portfolio for all those years and then to finally be selected. But what's even more impressive is we've still got a handful of staff that have worked with us for over 36 years. And so they've seen this whiskey from barley arriving at the distillery to winning one of the most prestigious spirits awards in the world. It's an incredible honour to have.
The award was for the 11th batch of the 36-year-old, which made its debut in 2015. The Tomatin 36-year-old also won Best of Show honors in 2017. Four Roses Bourbon is celebrating its 135th anniversary this year, and for the first time, the distillery is releasing a tasting kit with samples of all 10 recipes Four Roses uses in its whiskeys. The box also includes a QR code for a tutored tasting with master distiller Brent Elliott. It costs $129.99 and will be available at the distillery and retailers in Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, and California starting next month. New whiskeys announced this week. Craigellachie is releasing a 37-year-old bourbon cask-finished single malt. The whiskey was distilled in 1984 and originally was matured in refill casks before being transferred to ex-bourbon barrels. Around 3,000 bottles will be available at airport shops in Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and Istanbul, then at retailers in the UK, Germany, France, Taiwan, and China starting August 1st, with a recommended retail price of £3,800 a bottle. Arran is releasing a new 25-year-old single malt. It's the oldest in the Arran range so far and will become part of the distillery's core lineup. Only 3,000 bottles will be available globally right now, with 240 coming to the U.S. at a price tag of $789.99 each. Meanwhile, Arran's sister distillery, Lag, has released its first whiskey. The peated Kilmorey is matured in first-fill ex-bourbon barrels and bottled at 46% ABV with no-chill filtering. It's available now through the Arran website for £49.99 a bottle. And Douglas Lang & Company has released a new edition of its Timorous Beastie Highland Blended Malt. It's finished in port wine casks and kicks off the brand's Cheese Cellar collection of whiskeys crafted to be paired with cheeses. In particular, this one is said to pair well with a Stilton. It'll be available globally and will carry a recommended retail price in the UK of £65 a bottle. O'Shaughnessy Distilling in Minneapolis has released a cask-strength bottling of its Keeper's Heart Irish Whiskey and Bourbon blend. The blend brings together Irish pot still and grain whiskies from Great Northern Distilling in Ireland with 4-year-old MGP bourbon. It's bottled at 58.5% ABV and will carry a recommended retail price of $49.99 a bottle. And Nevada's Frey Ranch is releasing what it calls a farm-strength uncut bourbon, using the same mash bill as the distillery's award-winning bourbons. It's 5 years old and bottled at 62.1% ABV. It'll be available at the distillery, online, and at retailers in California and Nevada for $79.99 a bottle. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Time now to take a look at the calendar of upcoming whiskey events going on around the world. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. The National Whiskey Festival is coming up this Saturday in Inverness, Scotland. Sagamore Spirits' next Whiskey on the Waterfront party is on the 15th in Baltimore, Maryland. Whiskey Live Sydney is on July 21st and 22nd in Sydney, Australia. Belfast Whiskey Week kicks off on the 21st in Northern Ireland and runs through the 29th. Tales of the Cocktail is July 23rd through the 28th in New Orleans, Louisiana, and the Twisted Tale in Philadelphia will celebrate National Scotch Whisky Day on the 27th with a Lafroig tasting. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll be glad to add it to the calendar at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The calendar is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
Gabriel here. The new Dewar's 12-year-old has been completely remastered to be richer, smoother, and more balanced. It's a total winner. It's double-aged in first-fill premium bourbon casks for greater depth and breadth of flavor, with notes of apples, lemon zest, and spicy and floral notes with a long, smooth vanilla finish. The experts agree too. It's winning awards like pros sink putts. In fact, WhiskyCast's own Mark Gillespie gave it a 94-point rating, which is pretty amazing for a 12-year-old Scotch. It's also earned a 94-point rating from Whiskey Advocate. That makes it their highest-rated 12-year-old Scotch whiskey. It's an excellent testament to the skill, craft, and refinement of the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Dewar's. Drink responsibly. Copyright 2023 Dewar's Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. Together, Charles Maclean and Ian Buxton have probably forgotten more about whiskey than most people know. They're writers, historians, and consultants with a wealth of knowledge and perspective about the Scotch whisky industry. I brought them together this week on a Zoom call, and our conversation includes the wisdom of investing in whiskey, the future of independent bottlers, and whether this is a golden age for Scotch whisky. In fact, that's the first question I asked them. I think the key question is, are we in a new golden age of Scotch whisky? With all the new distilleries that are opening, even Campbellton's coming back, for crying out loud.
Fantastic, isn't it? I think. Should we kick off? Yes. Are we in a golden age? I think it is incredible. I mean, Charlie, you like me, you'll have been in and around this industry for longer than you care to remember. But probably, between either of us would have a 40-year horizon to look at this. And we can remember distilleries being closed down, being mothballed, even sort of derelict and sold off. And so, Mark, you've just alluded to the fantastic rate of new construction, but even more than the new construction of little so-called, I'll put them in quotes, craft distilleries. Look at the expansion that's going on of major plants. It's absolutely incredible. So I don't think we've seen anything like it since the sort of 1890s.
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree. I'm trying to find. I was writing something about this very earlier in the week, which would sum it up. But you're absolutely right. I think that there are all sorts of exciting things going on. Let's go on the upside. Let's stick with the upside at the moment.
Yeah.
First of all, the fact that so many of these long-established distilleries, and if you think of Glenlivet, Macallan, Glenfiddich,
yeah.
And then recently announced doubling capacity. The capacity, by my sort of back of an envelope, the capacity, the amount of whiskey, the spirit that can be made, has increased by 60% since 2004. And it probably is even beyond that, because I was doing my figures a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And this is accounting for the expansion of the new distilleries, as well as the foundation of new distilleries. Now, what this tells us is that the bean counters, for what it's worth, the actuaries who try and assess the demand for Scotch in coming years, 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time, are very, very positive about the very hopeful, let's say positive, because it probably is hopeful, but about the demand in coming years. And I think that we are in a global market, truly global market, which we were not when you and I started out, Ian.
Absolutely, yeah.
The big hopes, of course, are China and India, huge populations. India gagging for Scotch whisky. The biggest market in the world for whisky, but 95% of it is homemade Indian whisky, some of which is not too bad, some of which is actually not whisky because it's made from molasses alcohol. But the Indian market is perilous because the tax, the duties are applied state by state. And when the Indian central government, some years ago, do you remember in the days of Gavin Hewitt, I think it was when he was director of the SWA, the CEO, they call him now, of the Scotch Whisky Association. Massive celebration that the central government had brought down the duties because they were defying even World Trade Organization limits, and it was some preposterous sum. But what happens? Of course, all the states and that's to say the wet states, because there are numerous dry states. Gujarat, for example, there's more Scotch whisky drunk in Gujarat than any other state, and yet Gujarat is officially a dry state. You can't buy alcohol in Gujarat. It's a conundrum.
But notwithstanding that, I mean, you're absolutely right. We are experiencing now, which is very different from 40 years ago, a truly global market. And one of the lessons from the past was not to get all your eggs in one basket, because back then the market, the Scotch whisky industry was grossly over-reliant on the USA.
Correct.
Now we are talking about an absolutely global spread. And you're quite right. The demographic expansion that's going on all around the world, the wall of money that's come in from central banking, introducing quantitative easing programs all around the world has meant there's huge amount of money. Hence, some of the incredible prices we're seeing for aged single casks, for single bottles of Maclean, and so on and so forth. But you're right to point out the huge expansion of the established industry. We hear a lot about little craft distillery A and craft distillery B, which is adding 100,000 litres here and 150,000 litres there. But to be honest, although we all talk about it, it's exciting and interesting to write about, it doesn't amount to a row of beans compared to the global expansion. And I was just looking at some incredible numbers, which tells you how things have changed and how things are still the same for the world's top blended whiskies. And you were seeing whiskies like Dewar's, Black and White, Shivers, and notably Walker. Last year, 2022 over 2020, all of them showing double-digit increases in their sales volume. So something like Walker put on something like 22% sales growth in a year, according to Spirits Business. Dewar's 20% growth. I mean, and yet if you dialed back 50 years or 100 years, the names would still be Walker, Dewar's, Ballantyne, Shivers. So these big guys still dominate. But my goodness, the big are getting bigger. So, a fabulous golden age, really.
Yeah, but right. So then let's hold that for a second. So a lot of these distillery expansions are to supply. Still 90% of the malt whiskey made goes into blends. The blended Scotch leads the way. But the interesting thing is that most of the newbies, Inchdairney is an exception, but there are some exceptions. But most of the new distilleries, built with passion and commitment and devotion to quality rather than quantity, etc., exploring. But they're going to have to stand by their own creations. In other words, very few of them are going to be able to access, as was the traditional way in the Scotch whisky industry, that the annual gearing of any malt whisky distillery, the customer was the blender. And pretty well, 100% of the product went for blending. Began to change very slightly in the very, very slightly. Well, in 1970s, only 1% of the malt whiskey made was bottled as single malt. By 1980, it was for not much more, quite frankly. But nowadays it's still only around about 10%, slightly under 10%. But the new boys, they're going to have to. How do they differentiate their products? How do they persuade their agents, their distributors, that the customer will buy a second bottle? How do they differentiate one from another? So they're exploring, as you know, they're exploring old barley varieties. They're exploring longer fermentations. They're exploring different yeasts. Holyrood's leading that along with Heriot-Watt University, leading that. Different woods to some extent. All kinds of ways of differentiating one malt from another. And my goodness, they're producing some good whiskies. I've got beside me a bottle of Ardnamurchan. Well, actually, I'll tell you about that in a moment. But they are, and as are the English distilleries. Now, you see, that's another interesting thing, that the competition just down the road. I mean, if you look at the likes of Cotswolds or of Lakes or what's the one in Derbyshire?
Or Derbyshire, the Yorkshire, or you go into London and you've got several going on. Bimber doing some very, very interesting things.
Very good stuff.
You're absolutely right about that, Charlie. But and I think it is a risk. It is a risk because they don't have a blending audience, and if they're turning out, 100,000 litres, whatever, that's of no real interest to the blender walkers or dewars or shivers who are blending 5, 10, 15, 20 million cases. They're not really interested in some. But
it's
you're right.
Error.
It's a rounding error to them. So there is a danger there. And we'll talk in a minute about the great investment, the cask investment danger.
I leave it for a moment.
But I think there are two things that would give me hope if I was a small distiller. One is, again, looking over that kind of 40-year time scale, one is that the very considerably better quality of marketing that's going on in the industry. The level of marketing, the level of expertise, the level of data collection that they've got is just so much more sophisticated than was the case even 20 years ago, let alone 40 years ago. So they've got access to much, much better data. And today, they've got a much bigger, much better informed, much more enthusiastic consumer audience. You've got a very, very educated consumer base, very engaged, that any fast-moving consumer goods marketing person would give their eye teeth to get access to this type of audience, and they have access to incredible amounts of information, whether it's books, magazines, and above all the web. The level of information, which of course makes it for a level of challenge for our new distillers, but it gives me a little bit of hope that they will find little niches for their very, very highly specialized products.
Absolutely right. And social media. So the enthusiasts, some of your followers, Mark, the enthusiasts will speak to one another online, and if they discover, then potentially it can go viral, or at least they can. There's numerous sites putting up tasting notes, and so the whole market has changed. It has changed dramatically. But so this is all, I think, very hopeful. I think that the range of flavors available to us from these new distilleries has grown and will continue to grow substantially. And so this is all good.
This is all very good, and as well the level of scientific expertise that's now being deployed on the industry, whether it's from the fantastic output of graduates from Heriot-Watt and elsewhere, or when you look at the level of scientific qualification of people like Rachel Barry and Emma Walker leading the front for the blending industry, the level of scientific knowledge and the way they're able to interrogate the process and manage the process with much, much tighter process control is transformative in terms of delivering different product experiences.
Now, let me throw something in there, because you see that this is all very well, and I agree with you. But
stop. Stop.
No, see what a lot of the new ones are looking at, are exploring the past. So they're not. I mean, not all of them by any means have a chemical background, and but they're looking at the past. They're looking at old barley varieties, etc., and exploring things that are not commercially, because the big companies obviously are commercially driven. Looking at barley varieties, for example, as you know, the both of you, the given wisdom in the Scotch whisky industry is that the barley variety doesn't make a blind bit of difference to flavour. Now, I would doubt that myself. I mean, I remember once doing a tasting of New Make Spirit with after Gordon and Macphail bought Ben Romack when it had only just opened, and they did a number of experimental distillations, which I was privileged to taste, of different barley varieties. The modern ones at that time were things like Chariot and Prisma and Ricardo, etc. There were about 6 of them, and Golden Promise. Now, Golden Promise had been abandoned. It was the flavour of the month in the 1960s, because it could be grown in Scotland, where prior to that, pretty well all barley was imported from all over. And of course, Maclean made a great virtue of it, and then Goyne, I think, still does. But it became unfashionable for the simple reason that the farmers hated it, because barley varieties, they tend to become prone to disease. But more important, so what the farmer or the distiller is looking for is A, field yield, the amount of tons per acre you can get out of the field, and B, alcohol yield. The industry is particularly keen on yield of alcohol, because again, the traditional ones are based on blending. The blenders can make adjustments. But anyway, this experiment, I found it very difficult to distinguish between these new make spirits, except for one, which was oily, it was rich, it was fruity as new make spirit, and that of course turned out to be Golden Promise, and that was a revelation to me. And the barley varieties can make a difference.
I entirely, absolutely agree. I've sat with Mark Renier in his Bruichladdich days, and latterly with Mark at Waterford, obviously moving away a little bit from Scotch to Irish, but at Waterford. And he's passionate about the idea of terroir and the influence of different varieties and indeed different fields and different locations. And there's no doubt, I've sat there tasting with him, and if you're tasting with Mark, you kind of have to agree with him after a while, because otherwise he'll just beat you to death. But there was a very, very big difference. And of course, people have tried beer, barley, up at Highland Park, they've tried that, and I think elsewhere. But of course, the big driver a few years ago, as you've rightly alluded to, was pence per litre of spirit produced. And if you were driven by the shelf price of your blend, then that was very, very important. But if you're selling into the premium or ultra premium sector with a specialist single malt, and you're not trying to sell 1 million cases or even 100,000 cases, then frankly, a few pennies because of lower yield on the cost of your spirit is immaterial to the finished shelf price.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Ian. It was the multiples in the supermarkets who more or less nearly broke down the industry in the late 70s. Because they were all fighting on price, and you'll remember, heavens above, you were marketing director for Glenmorangie at the time, which at that time, late 70s, and
not quite that old, but but yes, guilty as charged.
But the supermarkets would say to the industry, right, do you want to participate in our Christmas promotion? In which case, give us the stock pretty well for free. The margins were tiny, and if you don't want to participate, well, you can bugger off, and you won't be listed over the Christmas period.
That's absolutely true. But the corollary of it was, at that time, with the industry in decline and under very, very intense pressure from newly fashionable white spirits.
Indeed.
What you did get with some of those supermarket blends was an incredible malt component in them. Some of them were actually fabulous tasting whiskies for really ludicrous prices, driven, as you say, by the supermarket buying power, which then worked backwards through the distillery and meant that the production director had to buy his barley as cheaply as he possibly could. But today, and the drinker knew no more about barley varieties than the man in the moon. Whereas today, you've got for that smaller, highly influential, very vocal group of people who are interested in specialist single malts, that they will pay a high premium to get a particular flavour, and whether that's delivered by the cask or whether it's delivered by the distilling regime or by the base grain, all of those things, they command a fantastic premium.
Yeah, that was particularly during the 80s when there was this vast surplus of now mature whiskey, and there were a lot of old malts being dumped into ordinary blends.
Well, that was my kind of entry period into the industry, when the thing was, the industry generally was in decline, and one lesson from then, I would say to people, don't lose faith. If we do hit a rocky period, don't lose the faith in the way that happened in the late 80s and early 90s with the raft of closures. You've just got to battle through. I think with this global market we talked about, with the more informed consumer, hopefully it's not going to happen again, at least in our lifetime. But don't lose the faith in the way that industry leaders did 35, 40 years ago.
But do you think now that raises the dread question of overproduction?
Are we going too far?
Well, yes, indeed, Mark. And that is the $1 million question. Have the bean counters got it right? Have the estimates? I mean, you can't tell. It's crystal ball and for demand. But what, as we all know, the 1890s finished in sadness with a change of fashion and massive overproduction. The post-war period, next great growth period, finished well for all sorts of economic reasons and change in fashion, as Ian alluded to, in the late 70s, and leading to the closures of the 1883 and the 1983 and 1985, and then the things were brought back in order by the early 90s, and things have been on a much more even keel. Well, into the 90s on a much more even keel. But now we have this huge growth, I would say, since around about 2004 in capacity.
But I think it's clearly a risk, isn't it? And nobody knows what the future holds. Who knew that we were going to have a COVID pandemic? Who knew we were going to have a new European war? Who knew we were going to have a very expansionist, commercially aggressive China to deal with? But the industry has kind of robustly rocked over those.
There we are, and as you said, your advice in those days was hold on to your pants, and look at those who have stocks of very old whiskey. From that bulge, that overproduction in the late 70s, early 80s in particular, those who have stocks of these whiskies can now sell them, these old 40-year-old whiskies, 50-year-old whiskies even, for eye-watering prices.
Eye-watering, unbelievable prices, Charlie. I was talking the other day, that the anonymous lady who bought the 2 combined casks of Ardbeg and paid allegedly £16 million, albeit that's everything, bottling, tax, duty, labels, but nonetheless, £16 million for a whiskey that,
I hope she likes Ardbeg.
It was Ardbeg. Yeah, I'm sure it's lovely. But in my lifetime, the place was falling down. I remember Michael Jackson writing very lyrically about the Gothic dereliction of Ardbeg Distillery, and it was falling apart. And similarly, I had the chance the other day to drink some very, very old 50-year-old Glenglassers. Absolutely stunning. I mean, really, really lovely whiskies. But I shudder to think what the price per bottle will be. But out there, as witness that £16 million private cask sale, there are people with the money, and they're not just collecting these whiskies. They're drinking them, they're sharing them with their friends, they're enjoying them. So fantastic. I suppose if you can afford a Bugatti, if you can afford a super yacht, you can afford to drop £20,000 or £30,000 on a bottle of whiskey for your chums and not think about it.
But we've got people doing that and trying to put their entire investment portfolio into whiskeys.
Well, now let's talk about investment, because oh God, how long have you got? And one thing, I'm just going to go back to a point from a little earlier. One thing I would make, again, looking at this kind of 40-year timetable, and is this a boom? Will it last? I do think that we have much better management integration across the industry. By which I mean when I entered the industry, you very much had production and marketing, such as it was, and it was really just a sort of fairly simplistic sales function, marketing, and in completely separate silos who didn't and wouldn't talk to each other. There was quite a lot of suspicion between the marketing people and the production people, and they went off and did their own thing in their own direction, and that was a little bit behind much of the overproduction that Charlie was referring to a minute ago. Now what we see, I think, is better marketing, better quality of that, far more marketing as opposed to pure sales, and hugely better integration and cooperation cross-functionally within the industry. And so that sophistication, it can't prepare you totally for future shocks. It can't prepare you for another Russian-Ukrainian war. It can't totally prepare you for a COVID. But my goodness, you're in a much better state than you were in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s. And now we can talk about investment.
Now, let me start. And indeed, I'd be very interested on Mark and Ian, your views on this. It seems to me that the investment, you see, there were always two categories of buyers. Or the original category was the blender, of course. All your malt went to the blenders, filling orders. But when it moved over to the consumer, it also moved on to the collector. All fine. Collectors, of course, being well, they all started in Italy, and the biggest collections were Italian collections, Silla, and apart from Sukinda. But then after 2008, when the stock markets collapsed, people with deep pockets were looking for alternative investments. And you mentioned fine art. You mentioned no, you didn't actually. But you traditional alternative investments were vintage motor cars, wine, gold, stamps, these sorts of things. And and then lo and behold, whiskey, particularly Scotch, and then very soon Japanese whiskey. Japanese whiskey, because it's rare. And it's delicious stuff. I mean, I would never knock it, but the amount of whiskey made in Japan in those days was so it makes it more desirable. Rarities is what a lot of investors are looking for, and then gradually over the last say 10 years, by 2017, Knight Frank were declaring that at auction, bottled whiskey was fetching or showing the biggest development in price rises at auction of any other product, including gold, wine, fine art, motor cars, etc. Now, this was picked up. Well, we can come to this in a second, but it was really only a clutch of brands that represented this massive growth in value, but it lured in, has lured in hordes of investors. You mentioned, Mark, people putting their whole portfolio into whiskey. Now, which is on the one hand is quite good for the profile of Scotch whisky or whiskey generally, but on the other, it depends. I mean, obviously, the value that you could put on any product, a work of art or a motor car or whatever, depends upon what people will pay for it, and then of course what people will sell it for, and so the investors are relying on the fact, assuming that their products, their investments, their whiskey is going to continue to rise in value, so that when they want to cash in after 20 years, let's say, they're going to make a tidy profit. Now, I don't know what your views are on this, Ian. But at the moment, the market is commanded by a clutch of brands. I think that there are other brands which, as you and I know, are equally good in terms of flavor profile, and so therefore so you don't have to go in and spend £250,000 or something for a bottle of something. You can come in and potentially have a good investment in that you'll be able to realize that in years to come. But it is a very volatile market, and and when we come to talk, as we will do, I hope, about cask investment and so on, it's there are a lot of chances out there now. I mean, let's stick with bottle investment at the moment, but it's potentially a good thing. By and large, do you want to talk about fakes? Because fakes have to come into the equation as well, because because of the value. You understandably, you've had fakes in the art market since classical times,
since forever, yeah.
And
since the second artist.
Yeah. But there's really nothing you can do about it. Fakery is becoming increasingly obviously there are, if you like, I think there are three types of fake bottles. There are those that were very difficult to discern, refilled bottles. There's a big market in empty bottles, particularly in certain markets. And I mean, at a low level, India, at a higher level, China. But this is not for auction. This is just for drinking. Refilled bottles. The wee boys in India they'll be paid so many rupees for empty bottles of Johnny Walker Black Label, Johnny Walker Blue Label. Oh, yeah. If it's got its carton, yes. Which they then, research. But it's been going on forever. And the refill bottles, very difficult. Then there are old bottles, there's long been a market for Victorian bottles, which are then the labels are forged and the bottles refilled. The closures and the auction houses they look very carefully at closure. For example, the capsules, and you remember that before the stopper cork was invented in 1913, and so before that there were all driven corks like wine bottles, and the capsule is one of the giveaways. You can test the paper, and Maclean, of course, they were left with egg on their chin, as it were, and they tested the glass and they tested the paper. It was all sound. And these were refill bottles, of course. But then, of course, they made the mistake of replicating these, and that was really rather embarrassing, because it seemed highly, highly likely. And you and I, Ian, have tasted some of these replicas, and really quite doubtful. But of course, you can't prove.
But Charlie, the great irony of all of that is that those replica Maclean bottles, now known to be based on fakes, command fabulous multiples, and people collect them knowingly what they are. Yes. And I've been kind of calling the end of the boom in bottle prices for as long as I can remember, and I keep getting it wrong, and it keeps going up, and it keeps going up. I do find it intensely depressing that bottles of whiskey are being traded like ingots of gold, and will never move off the shelf. They'll never move off the shelf. They'll never be drunk. I do find all that intensely depressing, and as people, I think, as young people say, it disses all the people involved in the making of that whiskey, from the farmer through to the chap in the bottling hall. So that I personally find very depressing, and I think sooner or later that bubble must burst. But I've been calling that.
Well, I don't know,
and it just doesn't. I mean, again, I go back to this sort of wall of easy money that's been pushed out by central banks right around the world, and it's led to the most incredible boom in asset prices, which is why, vintage cars and classic wristwatches and the price of your house have all shot up.
Mm.
I don't know. I really don't know where that's going to end. Generally, it ends catastrophically with a big burst and tears at bedtime.
Yeah. I think that we are talking global economies now, and it really depends upon the buoyancy of any economy at the moment. Obviously, those people who can afford these eye-watering prices tend to be Asian, and because the economies of China, well, China's having a dip, but it's recovering. Russia was in there, but it's all a bit. We won't talk about Russia. And India is a lot of Indian and American investors. You see
and so a lot of it tied up in status, and I'm kind of happier with the cask investors who then make some bottles and don't even sell them, drink them with their friends, and that's kind of great. It's the trophy bottles that just flip from site to site to site, putting on 20%, 50%, and whatever. It's the cynicism really of some of the distillers who will release lavishly packaged bottles in the sure and certain knowledge that there's stuff is never. It might as well be cold tea in the bottle. It's never going to be drunk, and there is there's a depressing cynicism about that. But that, maybe I'm just being overly romantic about it.
It is interesting. I don't know if you've got a view, Mark, on this. Because to some extent, can you blame them? I mean, I always remember when the Diageo released in 2001, the first of their special releases, and they released their first Port Ellen, which was quite old, like about 30 years old. And it was priced at £95, and and that was a lot of money in those days, by the way, and for a bottle of whiskey. And but of course, even then, the next year and the year after, they were flipping. People would buy it, flip it, and sell it for twice the price, 3 times the price. Of course, it's about what it is now, about $5,000 or something. But
many thousands. Yeah, I mean, I can, Charlie. Similarly, I can remember talking to old boys at Bowmore who declined to pick up the Black Bowmore in the staff shop at £80 on the grounds that who would pay £80 for a bottle of whiskey? Well, you can just about sell your house now for a bottle of Black Bowmore.
Yeah, exactly. And so but then Diageo, they realized this. It took them a couple of years.
It took them 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. Wait a minute. This is ridiculous. This is our product. Why aren't we capitalizing on it? So then, of course, the price went up significantly. And of course, the consumer collectors thought this was really greedy and unfair. And because but what do you do? So what I'm saying is that if you're sitting on stocks of old whiskies in the current state of the market, you can't really blame them from putting high prices.
No, you can't, Charlie. And if I was a shareholder of these companies, I'd be very, very cross if I thought they were selling this at anything other than market value. I don't have an answer to it. I just find it rather depressing.
These companies are not charities after all.
No, these companies are not charities. They're responsible to their stakeholders. They're responsible to their shareholders, and rightly so. I should say, it's just perhaps the romantic in me finds it slightly depressing that a lot of these whiskies will just be either shown off as trophies and can't ever be opened or touched, or just flipped. And by the way, let's not forget the boom that this has been for the auction houses. Of course, are making, they're making a fat percentage at both sides of the transaction, both a handsome fee to the seller and a stiff old commission on top of the hammer price. So got to be careful about Charlie, of course, because he's an auctions consultant, as we know.
Or X.
Good, very good.
I've lost out altogether.
You've lost that gig. Well,
but and let's also remember that you might be investing in whatever it is, but at least if the market crashes on whiskey, you can drink it.
Yeah.
Or give it away to your friend. I mean, if you sell your collection, or well, you can sell your collection at a loss, but you can drink it, for goodness sake. So it is a concrete asset.
I suppose like any investment, only spend what you can afford to lose.
Yeah.
If you happen to be one of those very few ultra high net worth individuals that we hear about who can afford these, £1 million wristwatches and £1 million motor cars, whatever, then as a small percentage of your portfolio, because you like whiskey, then why not have some very, very, or what seems to you and me, incredibly expensive whiskey to share with your chums? What I do worry about, and you alluded to it a minute ago, Charlie, is the sudden upsurge of people who've suddenly appeared on the scene as whiskey brokers, whiskey consultants, hyping stories of 12-15% and more return on very, very uncertain casks. And again, we go back to what we were talking about, these new small distilleries with no blending customer selling casks to Joe Public, who are not ultra high net worth individuals. Wonderful stories being told of the guy who bought a cask of Maclean for 4,000 quid 30 years ago, forgot about it, and got £1 million for it. Well, that's a true story, but there ain't any more £4,000 casks of Maclean to be had, and there aren't going to be.
Yep.
So a lot of the hype around this is incredibly misleading. And so whilst it might work for my ultra high net worth individual, and they are out there, it certainly doesn't work for John Doe. It doesn't work for widows and orphans, and steer well clear is my thought.
Well, this is absolutely true. Yes, a lot of the companies, these so-called cask investment companies, are run by people who they know about finance and investment. They know bugger all about whiskey. In more than one case, I mean, I was sort of approached by a friend, a company that I give some advice to, and they had been offered a cask. I won't give any names, but they'd been offered a cask. This was sort of last week, actually, when they got in touch, which they already owned. Well, Will Tope's cask of Springbank, and they already owned it. And this so-called investment company, offered them this very cask of Springbank. And they said, "Oh, yeah, very interested indeed. Send me a sample." They didn't even own the cask. It was owned by the person.
There we go, Charlie. I mean, have we not heard this song before? This is Robert and whatever his name was, Patterson, selling the same cask of whiskey to multiple buyers. Oh, I've got a piece of paper that says Mr. Patterson owes me this. Well, I've got this. And that, that was at the core of the whole Patterson thing. Going rapidly bust, people
in the 80s,
multiple claims on the same whiskey. So, and it doesn't surprise me, but because Springbank were selling into that consumer collector market, many years ago, and there are some beautiful private bottlings of Springbank to be had, or were to be had a few years ago. But again, forget trying to get a cask of Springbank now for anything that's remotely affordable. But how funny that there are. What should we say? I'll be careful what I say. So,
that's one of the problems, that they're offering things which they don't own.
Yeah.
They're offering casks which there's a thing, the Wauga. I don't know if you could explain which is apparently going to be abandoned. I don't know what that, but the transportation and housing. Where is the cask and so on? But there are all sorts of aspects to this, which the wise consumer needs to be advised about. And the advice, I know of two outfits that are drawing up lists of guidance, which will need to be, I think, authoritatively, signed off by the Scotch Whisky Association, and that for so not necessarily, but saying that this should be it should be made illegal. But this is any company offering casks should be able to state exactly what the fill and tick the box, or the purchaser.
But isn't there a simple answer to this, Charlie? Because you can have all the invoices, you can have all the certificate of authenticity, all the paperwork you like. But what you need is a piece of paper called the delivery order. And if you've got the delivery order from the distillery, then that cask is yours, and there's no legal argument about it. That's a 100% gilt-edged, legally watertight piece of paper. You own that cask as nominated on the delivery order. And some people, there has been quite a lot written about this, and I think up in Edinburgh, your younger colleague Blair Bowman has done some valuable work in alerting people to what's going on. But it does seem that some of the sales techniques are very slick. Some of the literature is very beautifully polished. The brochures are lovely. Their websites are fabulous. And people have been lured in by this talk of casks selling for £1 million and 12-15% investment. And when you're looking at today's cost of living crisis, and you're looking at your stock market not doing terribly much, et cetera, 12-15% on a cask of whiskey seems like a very good idea. But we do have a paper-based system around the delivery order.
Yeah, it would seem that the some of these companies show so-called delivery orders or whatever, but they're not worth the paper they're printed on.
They're not worth the paper they're written on. Certificate of ownership and
all these certificate of ownership, but there's no
meaningless.
But the other interesting thing to me is that the wise investor would want to know what the quality of the liquid is. And indeed, the decent company should be able to send them a sample to assess.
If that decent company actually has possession of the cask.
There is that small. There is that small.
But it seems to me extraordinary that people would. Well, I suppose if they're bouncing along thinking that we're never going to drink it anyway, and the price is going to go up, we don't want to see it. It's in a warehouse somewhere. Well, where is the warehouse and where is the cask lying? That's one question. But
I'll tell you a story about a private cask sales many years ago. I was in one of the old Dunwich warehouses at Maclean, and I was looking down the line of casks as you do, and they were just sort of a line of cobweb-infested casks. And partway down the line, I could see something strange. It looked like party streamers. So I wandered on down with my guide, and there was a cask down there with a party hat on it and some party streamers and birthday cards pinned on it. So I said, well, what's that about? And he said, well, it belongs to 4 guys from the Netherlands, 4 Dutch guys. And every year they come over and they have a birthday party for the cask. And they wish the cask happy birthday. They dip the cask. They have a big dram out of it. They let off some poppers, and then they go off. That's party poppers, not Dutch poppers. Let off some party poppers, put a party hat on it, have a nice big fat dram out of their cask, and go off and play golf. And 1 year, 3 or 4 years time, they will bottle it up and split it amongst themselves and their mates. So that's a very, very happy example. But they weren't investing in it, or what rather. They were investing in their pleasure. And I'd like to see people thinking in those terms. Invest in your pleasure. Forget about it for your portfolio. Forget about it for your pension. If you want a pension fund, go and buy some Anheuser-Busch shares, because they're at a bit of a dip at the moment, and you can probably pick those up more cheaply. Go and buy some Diageo shares. Go and buy some Pernod Ricard shares, which is properly regulated, reported properly, pays you a dividend, and is completely liquid when you come to sell it. If you want to invest in whiskey, invest in your pleasure and go and buy a nice bottle and then drink it.
I think that it's interesting you mentioned Bruichladdich. Some of the new distilleries are prepared to sell casks, not huge quantities of casks, because as Isle of Arran Distillery discovered when they were short of cash early on, and so they had this. It was quite an ingenious cask investment scheme where this was for consumers, and you paid, it was something like 400 quid or whatever it was, and and you got a cask, and you got a couple of cases of whiskey a year, blended Scotch, etc., until the cask was mature, and then you could have it bottled up, and that was you. But they depleted their stock, and this is a problem for the some of the new distilleries.
Potentially it's going to be a problem. If they're a success, it's going to be a problem.
Exactly.
But, Charlie, you'll remember that when you could privately buy a cask, and the big house in the village would buy a cask, and the pub might buy a cask, and a golf club might buy a cask, you were paying just a small premium over the industry filling price.
Indeed, absolutely.
And today you're now being asked, or what you're being offered is a tiny discount on the potential retail value of that whiskey 10 years out. It's absurd.
You're absolutely right. And I mean, what your viewers, Mark, won't realize is that the prices are for new mix spirit, for blending purposes, new mix spirit, and then whiskey at 2 years old, 3 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old, whatever it is, from each distillery are recorded. And the blenders know exactly where they stand. The prices that are asked for casks of whiskey at, let's say, 5, 8, 10 years old, whatever, bear no relation to the trade prices.
No,
is that not right, Ian?
No. They bear a relation to the anticipated retail shelf price of a bottle.
Yes.
And it's a shocker. The other thing, if you look at the contract for a number of these cask sales, the analogy that I used the other day, I was writing about it. So suppose let's say you buy a nice new car, Mark. You come home in your nice new BMW or whatever.
Okay.
And you get it back into the driveway, and the phone rings, and they go, "Oh, hello, Mr. Gillespie. It's BMW. How do you like your new?" "Oh, it's lovely." "Well, we're just here to remind you, you mustn't drive it more than 70 miles an hour, and you mustn't let your wife drive it, and forget about driving it to Texas. You're not allowed to do that." And you think, well, I don't think I really own this car, do I? They can tell me how far and how fast and who can drive it. I don't really own it. So if you buy a cask of whiskey and then you find, oh, well, I can't actually bottle this under the distillery label. I can't actually retail it. Did I actually own this whiskey, or have I just rented it and then they're telling me what I can and can't do with it?
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah,
and that has changed completely. And as I say, it's like you bought a motor car, and in reality, you're told exactly where, when, and how you can drive it.
Mm-hmm.
One final question. Are we getting to the point now, because of all these cask sales and because of the market for casks and the prices that have gone up exponentially, are we about to see a shakeout among independent bottlers? Because they're having trouble getting casks.
They're having trouble getting quantities, aren't they? But because the distillers want to hang on to a greater and greater percentage of their own production. So it's harder and harder for the independent bottler, unless they've got deep contacts in the industry.
That's the thing, deep contacts in the industry.
Deep contacts.
I mean, I know of one new distillery who has been, trading for. It began as an independent bottler and then built a distillery, and they're now in a position to trade spirit for old casks of whiskey, and so they're open to doing filling orders, not in huge quantity, but the filling orders to supply their requirements for the independent bottlings. Because you're absolutely right, Mark. It is so difficult for independent bottlers to find aged whiskey, because the people who are holding on who own old casks of whiskey, tend to want to hang on to them. But but there again, I was looking at 3 whiskies today, which were in their 50s, late 40s, 50s, and the one was very well. That was in the 60s, in the 1964, and that was very good. The other two, 1976 and 77, were. They weren't bad, but they were disappointing for their age, Mm. Now, why did I bring that in? So every now and again, but the independent bottlers can.
Charlie, you've referred there to that independent bottler of your acquaintance, who's gone on to build a distillery, and history is just repeating itself, because why did? What was his name? The original Morrison, not Brian Morrison, Brian's father, Stanley Morrison. Stanley Morrison. Yeah. So why did Stanley Morrison buy Bowmore? He was a very successful broker. Well, he bought Bowmore essentially because it bought him a seat at the table. So why have Gordon and a few years ago, Gordon and MacPhail bought
built. Ben Romack, and then
they bought Ben Romack, and now they're building. Well, why? Because it gets them a seat at the table. Why is Sukhinder Singh used his great riches to build on Isla and to buy not Tomatin, anyway, the one who drives past us. Again, what's he doing? He's buying a seat at the table with the big boys,
so
and that gets you access into that whole trading blending network.
Yeah, interesting. So, and you reckon that the part I won't be at all surprised. So, part of the thinking is that we can then trade our spirit for old whiskies to be used for as on the independent bottling side
if supplies and volume starts to tighten up, and you have access to a stream of new mate 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old whiskey, which a blending industry experiencing, as I've just said earlier, double-digit growth. They are in the market for meaningful quantities of new mate 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 5 or whatever whiskey, and then that becomes a tradable commodity that interests the likes of Sukhinder Singh, likes the Gordon and MacPhail, and then going back into history, worked for Stanley P. Morrison to transform his brokerage business into a distilling business.
Well, it also worked, if you want to go back even further in history, to John Walker and Sons buying Cardew Distillery.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's just his history repeating itself, which, boring old farts like Maclean and I actually lived through.
Thanks to Ian Buxton and Charlie Maclean for spending some time with us this week on WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with Aberfeldy's new 15-year-old Cabernet Sauvignon finish from its red wine casks collection. It's bottled at 43% ABV, and the nose has touches of red grapes, plums, and subtle spices. The taste has notes of cooked fruits, cinnamon, and honey, with a thick and chewy mouthfeel, while the finish is long and spicy with a touch of cooked fruits underneath. I'm scoring the Aberfeldy 15-year-old Cabernet Sauvignon finish a 93. Next up, let's look at the Dram Moore bottling of an 8-year-old single cask from Tullibardine Distillery. It's finished in Oloroso sherry casks and bottled at 53.7% ABV. The nose has touches of cooked fruits, oak tannins, plums, and raisins. The taste is thick and unctuous with plums, raisins, and dried fruits, balanced nicely by white pepper, honey, and oak. The finish is long with lingering spices and touches of raisins, plums, and a hint of apricots. I'm scoring Dram Moore's Tullibardine 8-year-old single cask a 92. And finally, I received a sample of Woodford Reserve's latest batch proof release the other day. This one is bottled at 62.35% ABV, and the nose has hints of toasted caramel, oak tannins, honey, and vanilla. The taste is peppery and intense, with notes of cinnamon, black pepper, honey, caramel, and vanilla. Adding some water opens up a touch of cocoa as well. The finish is long and dry with lingering spices, and I'm scoring the 2023 Woodford Reserve Batch Proof Bourbon a 90. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,500 whiskeys from all over the world at WhiskyCast.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit, a 200-time award-winning Maryland-style rye whiskey. With a determined focus to create the best rye whiskey imaginable, Sagamore's team of distillers crafts each spirit with a nod to both tradition and innovation. Find their signature, double oak, cask strength, or reserve series ryes, as well as their line of premium rye whiskey canned cocktails at a retailer near you. Visit sagamorespirit.com/find-rye. Please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's open up the WhiskyCast community app and see what's happening this week. Our community segment is brought to you by Waterford Whiskey. Tyrone Cote had this comment on last week's interview with the guys from Seattle's Westland Distillery. Just listened to Mark's interview with Matt Hoffman. Sad to see Matt retire from Westland, but wishing him all the best in what comes next. As do we, Tyrone. By the way, I've reached out to both Matt Hoffman and Tyler Peterson to find out what the impact of the Skagit Valley malting closure this week means for Westland, but have not yet received a response. Russ Charity shared a Toronto Star story about two police officers facing disciplinary action for allegedly taking home stolen alcohol seized during an arrest. Turns out one of the bottles stolen from a Liquor Control Board of Ontario store had a tracking device that pinged the home of one of the officers a couple of weeks later. Security cameras caught the officers leaving their station, each carrying a bottle of stolen Johnny Walker Black Label. Russ's comment? Keystone Cops. And Gary H.N. posted this note with a photo from Australia. Nipped into Launceston Distillery to pick up the latest release, a winter solstice bottling, peated tawny cask release. If you're coming to Tasmania, make sure you visit the guys. Even better if flying into Launceston, as the distillery is next to the airport. Sounds like a stop for Tasmanian Whiskey Week in early August. Wish I was going this year. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, download the free WhiskyCast community app from the Apple or Google App Stores and join the fun. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WhiskyCast. My email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Our community segment is sponsored by Waterford Whiskey, where they explore the frontiers of natural flavor one farm at a time to create unique Irish whiskeys. Visit them on the web at waterfordwhiskey.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history and science that makes whiskey unique. This week, let's look at a word that makes most whiskey purists cringe. Caramel. Not the candy, but the coloring added to many whiskeys to ensure consistency from batch to batch, or at least that's the official reason. As Willem Killian pointed out the other day on the WhiskyCast community app, there are a lot of fake tan-looking 10-year-old single malts out there. Specifically, E150A is the coloring most often used, and it's made by heating up sugars to the burning point with no chemicals added to the compound. Now, there's a difference between E150A and so-called burnt sugars, in that E150A is designated for food coloring, while burnt sugars are intended to add a flavor to the final product. Only a handful of countries require the use of caramel coloring to be disclosed on a whiskey label, though. Germany is the most well-known case, and you'll find mit Farbstoff on the back label of whiskeys with caramel coloring sold in Germany. You're more likely to find labels bragging that there's no added coloring than you are disclosures that the color has been tweaked, often by the same whiskey makers that eschew chill filtering, but that's a topic for another show. That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find our free WhiskyCast community app in the Apple and Google App Stores, and you can always get in touch with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at WhiskyCast. Of course, email's an option too. Our address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Find the new Dewar's 12-year-old and discover what all the awards are about. You can toast and thank me later. From Dewar's, the world's most awarded blended Scotch whisky.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever go out drinking with a peacock? Always the same. Few too many, tail feathers come out, drinks get knocked over, bartender's not happy, night's over before it started. All I'm saying is, don't be the peacock in your group.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2023, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.